What happens when two officers humiliate a young man, forcing him to scrub the pavement? Under the scorching sun, they never expected the man in the suit to walk in, and he wasn't just anyone. What unfolded next left the entire crowd speechless. It was one of those sweltering summer afternoons in the suburbs of Chicago, where even the pavement seemed to sizzle under the sun's relentless glare. James Blake, a 22-year-old law student with a knack for doing the right thing, walked briskly down the street, a paper bag from the local convenience store in one hand and a cold bottle of water in the other. His shoulders were broad, his stance confident, but there was an unspoken gentleness in the way he carried himself. Not 10 minutes ago, James had spotted an elderly woman sprawled awkwardly on the sidewalk, her cane knocked aside. Without hesitation, he rushed over, helped her to her feet, and offered her the water he'd just bought. He even walked her to a shaded bench nearby so she could catch her breath. The woman thanked him profusely, but James merely waved it off with a warm smile. For him, small acts of kindness were second nature. Gratitude wasn't required, but the warmth of the moment evaporated as quickly as the sweat on his brow when a police cruiser pulled up. With a screech, two officers stepped out, Kenneth and Brad, their mirrored sunglasses reflecting James' startled expression. "Hey, you," Kenneth called out, his voice sharp and deliberate. He sighed. James up with a squint. "What's in the bag?" James stopped in his tracks, caught off guard, his brow furrowed as he held up the bag and bottle. "Just some water and fruit," he replied calmly, his tone steady despite the growing tension in the air. But Kenneth wasn't buying it. "Oh yeah," he said, taking a step closer. "We saw you talking to that lady. What were you up to? Think we don't know your kind?" His partner, Brad, leaned against the car, smirking. James' jaw tightened. "My kind?" The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. He took a deep breath, doing his best to stay composed. "I helped her, that's all. Nothing else." But his explanation fell on deaf ears. Brad strode forward and snatched the bag out of his hand, spilling its contents onto the ground. The bottle rolled a few feet, glinting in the sunlight. James watched in silence as Kenneth crouched to inspect the spilled fruit, as though it might morph into something incriminating. Under his scrutiny, "Seems legit," Kenneth muttered before straightening up. "But since we've got your attention, how about you make yourself useful?" He pointed across the street at a small stain on the floor of their precinct driveway. "Why don't you clean that up? Do a good job, and maybe we'll forget this whole incident." For a moment, James just stared at them. Disbelief etched across his face. Was this really happening? His initial instinct was to push back, to demand answers, but he knew better. He'd been raised to understand that fighting fire with fire often led to more burns. So, with every ounce of dignity he could muster, James picked up the rag Brad tossed at him and walked to the stain. Kneeling on the hot concrete, he began scrubbing the rough surface, biting into his skin. His vision blurred, not from tears, but from the searing sunlight reflecting off the ground. Around him, passers-by hesitated. Some averted their gazes, while others discreetly filmed on their phones. He could feel their stares, each one a silent verdict, but none of them stepped forward. As he worked, anger churned in his chest, mingling with a deep, simmering frustration. He wasn't angry just at these officers, but at the system that allowed moments like this to exist, at the passers-by too afraid to intervene. He wasn't sure if it was the oppressive heat or the weight of his thoughts, but the stain on the pavement began to resemble something more. A symbol of everything he had been taught to endure, everything he wanted to fight against. This was just the beginning. What happens next will change everything. Stay tuned to see how. James faces even greater injustice. James stood up, his knees sore from the rough pavement, and let the rag drop to the ground. His hands damp and dirty hung by his sides, but his face told a different story. His expression was stone cold, his eyes locking onto Kenneth and Brad like a silent challenge. He wanted to walk away, to put as much distance as possible between himself and their smug grins, but as if on cue, Kenneth stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "Hold up," Kenneth said with a sneer, his posture oozing authority. "What? You think you can just walk away now? Someone needs to teach you some respect." Brad chuckled, leaning casually against the hood of the squad car. "Yeah, maybe remind him. This isn't a charity drive. We don't hand out free passes around here." James clenched his jaw so tightly that his teeth ached. He felt a familiar heat rise in his chest, the kind that made his vision sharpen and his breathing quicken. His father's voice echoed in his mind. "Stay calm, son. They expect you to lose control." It was a lesson drilled into him from a young age, one he'd practiced every time the world tested his patience, but that didn't make it any easier. He exhaled slowly, forcing his hands to remain still at his sides. "I've done what you asked. Let me leave," he said evenly, his voice cutting through the humid air like a blade. But Kenneth wasn't done yet. He took a step closer, his smirk widening. "Oh, you'll leave when we say you can. Don't get ahead of yourself." The tension was thick enough to slice. A few passers-by had stopped, their phones subtly aimed at the scene. Within moments, the quiet clicking of cameras and the soft murmur of voices signaled that this moment was no longer confined to the cracked pavement and scorching sun. It was becoming a spectacle. That's when she showed up, a slim woman with a determined stride and a professional-grade camera slung over her shoulder pushed her way to the front of the gathering crowd. She held a microphone in one hand and an air of confidence in the other. Her press badge glinted under the sunlight. "James Blake," she said, stepping forward as the tension in the air seemed to shift. "You have anything to say about the situation?" Her voice was clear, deliberate, and loud enough to carry over the murmurs of the crowd. Kenneth and Brad froze for a second before exchanging a glance. Their amusement vanished. "Turn that off," Kenneth barked, storming toward her. "You're not authorized to film here." The reporter didn't flinch. Instead, she raised her microphone higher, leveling it with James. "Do you believe this treatment is fair?" she asked, her tone calm but pressing. Before James could respond, Brad joined Kenneth in trying to block her. "I said turn it off," he snapped, his voice louder now, tinged with irritation, but the woman held her ground, her eyes steady. "You're making this worse for yourselves," she replied, her voice steady but with an edge sharp, enough to cut glass. The crowd began to shift, their murmurs turning into loud protests. "Leave her alone," someone yelled. "This ain't right," shouted another. Kenneth turned to the crowd, his face red with frustration. "Everybody back up," he ordered, raising his hand to shoo them away. But then James stepped forward. "Enough," he said, his voice firm, louder than anyone had expected. The officers froze, their heads whipping back toward him. The crowd hushed, eyes darting between James and the cops. "You don't get to intimidate people into silence," James continued, taking a step closer to Kenneth and Brad. "Not her, not me, not anyone here. You're supposed to serve and protect, right? Then act like it." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time, Kenneth and Brad looked uncertain, their authority slipping in the face of James's unwavering stance. But their uncertainty didn't last long. Kenneth's expression darkened and Brad's hand twitched at his side. The crowd murmured in confusion as a deep, commanding voice cut through the chaos like a knife. "What is going on here?" Every head turned, including James. The sea of onlookers parted as a tall man in a crisp, dark suit strode forward with purpose. His polished shoes clicked against the pavement, each step radiating authority. It was Captain Richard Blake, Kneat, chief of the local police department. His presence alone seemed to suck the air out of the street. For a moment, James felt like the world had frozen. "Dad," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the stunned silence. Kenneth and Brad exchanged panicked glances, the color draining from their faces as realization hit. They stood, rigid like soldiers caught out of line. "Captain Blake," Kenneth stammered, his usual bravado crumbling. But the captain didn't even look at him. His piercing gaze was fixed on his son, standing tall amidst the chaos. His eyes shifted to the rag still clenched in James's hand, to the streaks of dirt on his knees. His face darkened, a mix of fury and disbelief etched into his features. He turned to his officers, his voice low but menacing, like a storm waiting to unleash. "Explain yourselves now." Brad tried first, his words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "Sir, he was... There was a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Captain Blake's voice rose sharply. The crowd tensed. "You forced my son to clean the pavement like some sort of punishment, humiliated him in front of an audience, and you call that a misunderstanding?" Kenneth stepped forward, raising his hands as if to calm the storm. "Captain, we didn't know he was your..." "Stop talking," Captain Blake interrupted, his voice slicing through the air. He raised a hand, silencing Kenneth mid-sentence. The tension in the air was unbearable. The crowd stood motionless, their phones capturing every moment, every word. The captain's glare moved between the two officers, who now looked like children, caught red-handed. "You've disgraced this department," he said slowly, each word dripping with contempt. "You've disgraced me, but most of all, you've disgraced yourselves." Kenneth and Brad were visibly trembling. "Captain, we didn't mean..." "I don't care what you meant," he snapped, cutting them off again. "Take off your badges, now." The crowd gasped. Phones zoomed in as Kenneth and Brad hesitated, their hands twitching toward their chests. "Do it," Captain Blake barked, his voice echoing off the buildings. "You're both suspended, effective immediately, and trust me, this is just the beginning." The officers complied, fumbling with their badges as they placed them in the captain's outstretched hand. He didn't bother looking at them. Instead, he turned back to James, his face softening for a moment before settling into a neutral mask. James's eyes met his father's, a storm of emotions brewing within him. Triumph? Yes. Relief? Maybe, but mostly, he felt empty. This wasn't justice. It was a bandage on, a wound that ran far deeper. "This happens every day," James said, his voice steady but laden with conviction. "Not just to me. What are you going to do about it?" The question hit like a hammer. "Captain," Blake's face hardened, but there was something behind his eyes, hesitation, guilt, maybe even shame. He looked at his son, then at the crowd, then at the badges in his hand. For the first time in his career, Captain Blake felt the weight of the system he had spent his life upholding, the same system that had failed his own son. "I'll do better," he said finally, his voice quieter but resolute. "We'll do better." The words hung in the air, heavy with the promise of change. But for James, the moment wasn't about words. It was about action. He turned to the crowd, their faces filled with hope, anger, determination. Someone in the back cheered, and it spread like wildfire. The video of the confrontation exploded online within hours, sparking a nationwide outcry. It wasn't just about James or his father anymore. It was about a movement, a demand for accountability, for dignity, for change. And James, he wasn't done, not by a long shot. This was just the beginning of his fight, a fight that would inspire others to stand tall, no matter how many times the world tried to bring them to their knees.